In the profound silence of the night, President Ibrahim Traoré stood behind the glass windows of his residence, gazing out at the city lights that twinkled like scattered diamonds across Ouagadougou. The capital of Burkina Faso stretched before him, a tapestry of hopes and struggles woven together in the darkness. But tonight, something weighed heavily on his soul, a question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Do I really know how my people live? The thought echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. Or have I become just another ruler who relies only on files and reports, disconnected from the reality of those I serve? The weight of this uncertainty pressed down upon him like a physical burden. He had risen through the ranks of the military, fought for his country's independence, and now sat in the highest office of the land. Yet, despite all his achievements, he felt an unsettling distance between himself and the people he had sworn to serve. The reports that crossed his desk spoke of statistics and policies, but they failed to capture the essence of human struggle, the daily battles fought by ordinary citizens just to survive. As the night deepened, Ibrahim made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to any other head of state. It was a choice born not of political calculation, but of genuine hunger for truth. He would strip away every layer of privilege and protection that separated him from his people. He would walk among them not as their president, but as one of them, perhaps even lower, to truly understand what it meant to be powerless in his own nation. The following morning brought with it a transformation that would shake the very foundations of Burkina Faso. As dawn broke over the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré began to shed his identity piece by piece. He removed his military uniform, the symbol of his authority and strength, the medals that spoke of his service, the insignia that commanded respect, all were carefully placed aside. From his personal quarters, he retrieved old, tattered clothes that had been stored away, remnants from his youth when poverty was not a policy issue but a lived reality. The fabric was worn thin in places, stained with the honest sweat of labor and hardship. He dressed slowly, feeling each piece of clothing transform him from president to pauper. The final touch was the most crucial. He took handfuls of dirt from a potted plant and rubbed it into his face and hands, allowing the earth to stain his skin and settle under his fingernails. The man who looked back at him from the mirror was unrecognizable, not the dignified leader who addressed the nation on television, but a broken figure that society had forgotten. Without protocol, without bodyguards, without any trace of his former identity, Ibrahim Traoré stepped out into the world as a beggar. His destination was the famous Ouagadougou market, the beating heart of Ouagadougou, where the pulse of ordinary life could be felt most keenly. The market was alive with the chaotic symphony of commerce. Women called out prices for mangoes and tomatoes, their voices rising above the din of bargaining customers. Children weaved through the crowds, some helping their parents, others simply lost in the joy of play despite their circumstances. Men in worn clothing hawked everything from second-hand clothes to simple tools, their weathered faces telling stories of resilience and endurance. Ibrahim found a corner spot among the vendors, far enough from the main thoroughfare to avoid drawing attention, yet positioned perfectly to observe the intricate dance of daily survival. He spread a torn piece of cloth on the ground and placed an empty bowl before him, the universal symbol of need and supplication. For hours he sat in silence, watching as life unfolded around him. The experience was both humbling and revelatory. From his new vantage point, literally at ground level, he could see details that had never appeared in any government report. He noticed the worn soles of shoes, the careful way mothers counted coins before making purchases, the tired lines around young faces that spoke of burdens too heavy for their years. An elderly woman shuffling past caught his attention. She stopped at a vegetable stall, examined some onions with the practiced eye of someone who had to make every franc count, then shook her head sadly and moved on. The simple act spoke volumes about the economic reality his people faced daily. As the sun climbed higher, conversations began to drift toward Ibrahim's corner. A woman selling fabric to another vendor sighed heavily and said, "I work from dawn to dusk, but I can only give my children rice. Plain rice without even a proper sauce to go with it." Her words cut through him like a blade. An old man sitting nearby muttered to his companion, "These leaders only know how to make speeches. Nothing ever changes for people like us. They live in their palaces while we scrape by in the dust." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Ibrahim felt each word as a personal indictment. As the hours passed, Ibrahim began to understand that his experiment was revealing layers of truth he had never imagined. The reports that reached his desk spoke of unemployment rates and inflation figures, but they could never capture the soul-crushing reality of a mother choosing between medicine for her sick child and food for the family. A group of young men gathered near a tea cellar, their conversation animated but tinged with frustration. One of them, barely out of his teens, spoke with the weariness of someone much older. "I finished school 3 years ago. I've applied for every job I could find. Nothing. My mother keeps asking when I'll be able to help with expenses, and I have no answer for her." Another youth nodded grimly. "My brother left for Libya last month. Said he'd rather risk the desert and the sea than waste away here. I'm thinking of following him." The casual way he spoke of such a dangerous journey revealed how desperate their situation had become. Ibrahim's heart ached as he listened to these conversations. These young people weren't statistics in a demographic study. They were the future of his nation, and they were slipping away because they saw no hope at home. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he sat, the most powerful man in the country, disguised as the most powerless, learning that his power meant nothing if it couldn't reach those who needed it most. As evening approached, the market began to wind down. Vendors packed up their goods, counting the day's meager earnings with expressions that ranged from resignation to quiet determination. Ibrahim realized he would need to find shelter for the night, something he had never had to worry about in his entire adult life. He made his way to an area behind the market where others like him, the homeless, the forgotten, gathered for the night. The ground was hard and unforgiving, littered with refuse and offering no comfort. Mosquitoes swarmed in the humid air, and the smell of decay from nearby waste created an assault on the senses. The next day brought new revelations and a moment that would forever change Ibrahim's understanding of his people. As he took his usual position in the market, a group of young troublemakers noticed him. They were the kind of idle youth who had nothing better to do than torment those even more unfortunate than themselves. "Hey, beggar!" one of them called out with cruel laughter. "Dance for us! Show us some entertainment." Another threw a rotten banana at him, causing passers-by to stop and stare. Some laughed along with the youths, while others hurried past, averting their eyes from the scene. Ibrahim's first instinct was to reveal himself, to use his authority to stop this humiliation. But he forced himself to remain in character, understanding that this too was part of the truth he had come to discover. This was how the powerless were treated in his country, not with compassion, but with contempt. One of the youths stepped closer, grabbing at Ibrahim's dirty clothes. "Look at this! This is what we call a human being. The smell alone could kill you." The laughter grew louder, more cruel. But then, like a ray of light breaking through storm clouds, a small voice cut through the mockery. "Stop it!" The voice belonged to Zainab, a 12-year-old girl who had been helping her mother at a nearby stall. She was small for her age, her clothes patched but clean, her eyes blazing with an indignation that seemed too large for her tiny frame. She pushed through the crowd of tormentors and stood defiantly between them and Ibrahim. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves," she declared, her young voice trembling with emotion but unwavering in conviction. "This is a human being just like you. What gives you the right to treat anyone this way?" The youths laughed and mocked her too, but Zainab didn't budge. Instead, she opened her small lunch container, a simple tin that contained what was probably her only substantial meal of the day. She took out a piece of bread, carefully wrapped in paper, and placed it gently in Ibrahim's hands. The gesture was so pure, so unexpected, that Ibrahim felt tears welling up in his eyes. He wasn't hungry, at least not for food, but in that moment, the bread tasted sweeter than any feast he had ever enjoyed in the presidential palace. This wasn't charity. It was humanity in its rawest, most beautiful form. "Thank you, my child," Ibrahim managed to whisper, his voice thick with emotion. Zainab smiled at him with the radiance that only children possess. "You're not alone," she said simply, then rejoined her mother at their stall. Those 4 words, "you're not alone," resonated in Ibrahim's mind for the rest of the day and into the night. As he lay on the hard ground, using his arms as a pillow, he reflected on all he had learned. But fate had more lessons in store for him. On his 4th night as a beggar, as Ibrahim tried to find sleep despite the discomfort and the sounds of the city that never truly quieted, he noticed 2 figures moving stealthily through the shadows. One was clearly a local. His posture and clothing marked him as someone from the government or military establishment. The other was foreign, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in this part of the city. Curiosity overrode caution, and Ibrahim quietly followed them to a secluded area behind an abandoned shop. Hidden behind an old cart, he strained to hear their conversation. What he learned chilled him to the bone. "Everything is ready?" the foreigner asked in accented French. "Absolutely," replied the local conspirator. "The gold concessions will be ours. Just waiting for the signatures. The people will never know what hit them. And if word reaches the president?" The local man laughed with cruel confidence. "It won't. We've bought everyone who matters. Officials, reporters, even some of his security detail. Money has a wonderful way of closing mouths." Ibrahim's blood ran cold as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just corruption, it was treason of the highest order. They were planning to sell off Burkina Faso's gold reserves, the nation's most precious resource, to foreign interests. If successful, it would rob the country of its future and condemn its people to deeper poverty. But he was just a beggar now, powerless to act immediately. He would need to be patient, to gather evidence, and to find the right moment to expose this betrayal. Over the following days, Ibrahim carefully tracked the conspirators' movements. They met in different locations throughout the city, always in secluded spots, always conducting their business in whispered tones. He memorized faces, noted times and places, and tried to piece together the full extent of their network. The conspiracy was larger than he had initially suspected. It involved not just the sale of gold concessions, but a systematic looting of the country's natural resources. Foreign companies were poised to strip mine the nation's wealth while leaving the people with nothing but environmental devastation. But on the 5th day, Ibrahim's cover was nearly blown. One of the conspirators, a man he recognized as a mid-level government official, looked directly at him with suspicion. "That beggar has been around here quite a bit lately," the man said to his companion. "It's strange how he always seems to be in the same areas where we meet." "Don't worry about it," the other replied dismissively. "He's just another street person. They wander around looking for handouts. He couldn't understand our business even if he heard every word." Ibrahim quickly lowered his gaze, picked up his bowl, and shuffled away in the manner of someone accustomed to being dismissed and ignored. His heart pounded as he moved, knowing that his entire mission, and possibly his life, hung in the balance. After a week of living as a beggar, Ibrahim had gathered enough evidence to expose the conspiracy. But he also understood that simply returning to his palace and making accusations wouldn't be enough. He needed to do something dramatic. Something that would not only expose the corruption, but also demonstrate to his people that their leader truly understood their struggles. The morning sun was particularly harsh as it beat down on the marketplace. The air shimmered with heat waves, and the usual bustle seemed more subdued as people sought shade wherever they could find it. Ibrahim knew this would be the day of reckoning. The 2 main conspirators appeared right on schedule, meeting in the central alley of the market. They carried with them a briefcase containing the final documents that would seal the deal, contracts that would hand over Burkina Faso's mineral wealth to foreign corporations in exchange. For personal enrichment, Ibrahim took a deep breath, looked up at the sky as if seeking divine strength, and then began his transformation back to power. He stood up straighter than he had in days, brushed the dirt from his clothes, and removed the cloth that had been covering his face. The change was immediately noticeable. Even covered in dirt and dressed in rags, there was something unmistakably commanding about his bearing. A child playing nearby was the first to notice. "Wait, isn't that Captain Traoré?" the boy said, using Ibrahim's military title. The words spread through the crowd like wildfire. People stopped their activities and turned to stare. Whispers became exclamations of disbelief. "It can't be. Is that really the president? What is he doing here dressed like that?" Ibrahim stepped forward into the center of the crowd, his voice carrying the authority that no disguise could fully hide. "People of Burkina Faso," he began, his words cutting through the marketplace chatter like a sword through silk. "What you see before you is your president, yes, but more importantly, it is someone who has lived among you, suffered with you, and learned the truth about our nation that no report could ever convey." He held up the briefcase he had taken from the stunned conspirators. "In this case are documents that would have sold your birthright, your gold, your children's future to foreign companies. These men," he pointed at the would-be traitors, "came to steal from you while you struggled to feed your families." The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Anger rippled through the gathering like an electric current. People pressed forward, their faces showing a mixture of rage at the betrayal and amazement at their president's dramatic revelation. The foreign conspirator tried to run, but a vegetable seller grabbed his leg. The local trader looked around desperately for an escape route, but found himself surrounded by the very people he had planned to rob. But Ibrahim raised his hand, calling for calm. "No," he said firmly. "We want justice, not revenge. These men will face trial in our courts so the world can see that Burkina Faso has awakened." The crowd erupted in cheers and chants. "Long live Traoré! Long live justice!" For the first time in years, the marketplace, usually heavy with fatigue and poverty, sparkled with hope and dignity. Zainab stood in the crowd, her eyes shining with pride and recognition. Ibrahim's gaze found hers across the sea of faces, and they shared a silent acknowledgement of the role her simple act of kindness had played in this moment of truth. The dramatic revelation in the marketplace was captured on dozens of cell phone cameras and spread across social media within hours. The hashtag #TraoréTruth began trending globally, and news outlets around the world picked up the story of the president who had disguised himself as a beggar to discover the truth about his nation. That evening, the state television broadcaster aired a special program featuring footage of Ibrahim's days as a beggar. The moments when he was mocked and pelted with rotten fruit, when Zainab defended him and shared her bread, when he witnessed both the cruelty and compassion that existed side by side in his society. The video had a profound impact on the nation. People poured out of their homes not to protest against the government, but to celebrate a leader who had shown he truly understood their struggles. This wasn't about party politics or ideological movements. It was about truth and genuine leadership. Within a week, Ibrahim called for a massive public assembly. Tens of thousands gathered in the capital's main square. When Ibrahim took the stage, he wore neither his military uniform nor a formal suit, but the same simple clothes he had worn as a beggar. "I stand before you today not as your president by title, but as your fellow citizen by experience," he declared. "I have felt your pain in my own body, heard your struggles with my own ears, and witnessed your strength with my own eyes. If you want me to continue serving you, I will. If you believe someone else would serve you better, I will step aside, right now." A moment of profound silence fell over the crowd. Then a young man shouted, "We need Traoré!" A mother cried out, "For our children, we need Traoré!" Soon the entire square was echoing with chants of support. The people had chosen him not through an election, but through something deeper, through trust earned in the most humble circumstances possible. Ibrahim's first official act after this dramatic reaffirmation was to decree that all of Burkina Faso's gold mining operations would now benefit directly the people. Every profit would go toward education, healthcare, and agricultural development. No longer would foreign companies extract wealth while leaving only environmental damage behind. He launched comprehensive anti-corruption investigations, not through secret police or intimidation, but through transparent public processes. He established citizen complaint centers in every major city where people could report corruption without fear of retaliation. The presidential palace underwent a dramatic transformation as well. Ibrahim removed expensive carpets, luxury furnishings, and unnecessary decorations. His office featured the same simple wooden desk he had used as a military captain. "The walls of my office should be plain," he told reporters, "so I never forget that I am a servant of the people, not their king." Educational reform followed quickly. Schools were built in rural areas that had never had access to formal education. Every child received free textbooks, and university education became accessible to students regardless of their family's economic situation. Healthcare clinics were established in remote villages. Ibrahim personally visited these facilities, often arriving unannounced to ensure they were actually serving the people rather than existing only on paper. Perhaps most importantly, he kept his promise to Zainab. The young girl who had shared her bread with a beggar was enrolled in an accelerated education program, with the government covering all expenses for her to become a doctor. When Ibrahim presented her with the scholarship documents, Zainab asked with tears in her eyes, "Can poor people's dreams really come true?" Ibrahim replied, "Dreams don't change themselves. Sometimes someone has to become a beggar to make them possible." Ibrahim's transformation of Burkina Faso didn't go unnoticed by the international community. The United Nations invited him to address the General Assembly, where he delivered a speech that would be remembered for generations. "I come from a nation that has opened its eyes," he told the assembled world leaders. "We are not a people who sell gold to buy concrete. We are not a people who sell dreams to buy deceptions. We are a people born from the earth, and we live not to sell our soil, but to nurture it." His words resonated across Africa, where young people began to see him as a beacon of hope, proof that authentic leadership was possible even in a world dominated by corruption and foreign exploitation. However, not everyone celebrated Ibrahim's reforms. Former power brokers, wealthy businessmen who had profited from the old system of corruption, and international corporations that had lost lucrative deals began to organize resistance. Secret meetings were held in luxury hotels in neighboring countries. Plans were made to destabilize Ibrahim's government through economic pressure and political manipulation. But Ibrahim had learned from his days as a beggar that the most dangerous enemies often hide in plain sight. His intelligence services, now staffed with people chosen for their loyalty to the nation rather than personal connections, uncovered evidence of these plots. But rather than responding with authoritarian measures, Ibrahim chose transparency. On a quiet Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after his transformation from beggar to beloved leader, Ibrahim received intelligence about a new conspiracy. This one was more serious than anything before. A planned military coup backed by foreign interests and funded by the same corporations whose deals he had canceled. The plan was sophisticated. Create economic chaos through coordinated strikes in key industries. Blame Ibrahim's policies for the resulting hardships, then present a military intervention as the only solution to restore stability. Ibrahim called an emergency meeting with his most trusted advisors. The room was tense as they reviewed the evidence, recorded conversations, financial transfers, even specific dates for the planned uprising. "Mr. President," his security chief said gravely, "we need to act immediately. Arrest the conspirators, impose martial law if necessary. We can't let them destroy everything we've built." But Ibrahim sat quietly for a long moment, then smiled with the same calm confidence he had shown in the marketplace a year earlier. "No," he said firmly, "we won't rule through fear or force. We'll do something they won't expect. We'll trust our people." The next day, Ibrahim appeared on national television for what he announced would be a special address to the nation. But instead of speaking from the presidential palace, he broadcast from the same marketplace where he had revealed the gold mining conspiracy. Sitting on a simple stool, wearing ordinary clothes, he looked directly into the camera and spoke as if he were talking to each citizen personally. "My fellow Burkina, he began, "forces are working to destroy the progress we've made together. They want to return us to the old days when foreign companies could loot our resources while our children went hungry. They want leaders who rule from palaces instead of walking among the people. He paused, letting his words sink in. I could use the power of government to stop them. I could arrest them, impose restrictions, rule through force. But that would make me exactly like the leaders I once criticized. Instead, I'm asking you to make a choice. If you believe in the path we've taken together, show it. Come to the streets not in anger, but in unity. Show the world that the people of Burkina Faso have awakened and cannot be put back to sleep. The response was unlike anything in Burkina Faso's history. Within hours of Ibrahim's address, people began streaming into the streets of every major city. They came not as protesters, but as citizens reclaiming their nation. In Ouagadougou, the main square filled with hundreds of thousands of people from all walks of life, farmers, teachers, students, small business owners, civil servants, and many who had no formal employment but came anyway to defend their hopes for a better future. Zainab, now a medical student, spoke to the crowd about the day she had given bread to a beggar without knowing he was the president. He taught us that true leadership comes from below, not from above, she said. When we lift up the lowest among us, we lift up our entire nation. Coffee, the former vegetable seller who had become a school principal, addressed the teachers in the crowd. Education isn't just about books and classrooms. It's about learning to see the truth even when powerful people try to hide it. Similar scenes played out across the country. In villages and towns, people gathered to show their support for Ibrahim's government and their rejection of those who would return them to the old ways of exploitation and corruption. The planned coup never materialized. Faced with such overwhelming popular support for Ibrahim, the conspirators realized their cause was hopeless. Many fled the country, while others sought to negotiate their surrender. Following this display of popular support, Ibrahim made an unexpected announcement. Rather than using the crisis to consolidate power, he proposed a new constitution that would institutionalize the lessons he had learned as a beggar. The new constitution included unprecedented provisions for government transparency. Every major policy decision would require public consultation periods. Government officials would be required to spend time working in the communities they served. The president would be limited to a single term and would face regular confidence votes from citizen assemblies. Most remarkably, the Constitution included what became known as the Beggar Clause, a provision requiring that any president, upon taking office, spend 1 month living anonymously among the poorest citizens of the nation, without security detail or special privileges. Power should never be comfortable, Ibrahim explained to the Constitutional Convention. The moment a leader stops feeling the struggles of his people, he stops being worthy to lead them. As Ibrahim's presidency entered its final year, he refused calls to extend his term. The transformation of Burkina Faso became a model studied around the world. The country's economy grew not through exploitation of resources by foreign companies, but through investment in human capital and sustainable development. Zainab graduated medical school with honors and opened the first free clinic in her childhood neighborhood. She named it the Bread Clinic in honor of the simple meal that had connected her to her president. Coffee School became a model for education reform, emphasizing critical thinking and civic engagement alongside traditional subjects. Students from around West Africa came to study his methods. The former vegetable seller who had defended Ibrahim during his time as a beggar, Aminata, used a government small business loan to expand her trading activities. She now employed dozens of people and had become a respected voice in the business community. But perhaps the most important change was in the mindset of the people themselves. Young people no longer dreamed of leaving Burkina Faso for opportunities abroad. Instead, they saw their country as a place where their talents and ambitions could flourish. On the last day of his presidency, Ibrahim made one final appearance in the marketplace where his journey had begun. He arrived, not with fanfare or ceremony, but quietly, just before dawn. When only a few early vendors were setting up their stalls, he found the same corner where he had sat as a beggar and lowered himself to the ground one more time. As the sun rose and the market came to life, people gradually noticed him and began to gather. A small child, born after Ibrahim's famous transformation, approached him curiously. "Uncle," the child asked, Why are you sitting on the ground? Ibrahim smiled and gestured for the child to sit beside him. Sometimes, he said gently, the most important things can only be seen from down here. As more people gathered, Ibrahim spoke informally to the crowd, not as a president giving his farewell address, but as a neighbor sharing wisdom. I learned something important during my time as your leader, he said. The distance between a palace and a marketplace is not measured in kilometers, but in understanding. A leader who cannot bridge that distance is not really leading at all. When Ibrahim officially left office that afternoon, he didn't retire to a life of luxury or international speaking engagements. Instead, he quietly took a job as a teacher in a rural school, living in the same simple conditions as his fellow educators. His successor, chosen through the most transparent election in the nation's history, was a former nurse named Fatima Ouedraogo, who had worked in the free clinics established during Ibrahim's presidency. She took her oath of office wearing the same simple dress she wore to work, and announced that her first act would be to complete her required month living among the poor. The transition ceremony itself broke all precedent. Instead of taking place in the presidential palace, it occurred in the very marketplace where Ibrahim had revealed his truth. Thousands of ordinary citizens witnessed the peaceful transfer of power, with children from local schools singing the national anthem alongside the formal proceedings. Fatima's month among the poor proved even more revealing than Ibrahim's original journey. As a woman, she experienced additional layers of discrimination and vulnerability. She lived in a women's shelter, worked in a textile factory for below minimum wages, and faced the daily harassment that many women endured simply trying to survive. Her experiences led to groundbreaking legislation protecting women's rights and establishing a national child care system that allowed mothers to work without worrying about their children's safety. She also created the Sister Cities program, pairing prosperous urban areas with struggling rural communities to share resources and opportunities. The Beggar president's influence spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders like ripples in a pond. In Ghana, a young politician named Kwame Asante read about Ibrahim's transformation and decided to spend a month living in the slums of Accra before running for parliament. His first-hand accounts of urban poverty led to the largest housing reform program in Ghana's history. In Senegal, a wealthy businessman named Amadou Tall was so inspired by Ibrahim's story that he liquidated his luxury assets and used the money to fund microfinance programs for women entrepreneurs. I realized I had been living like a king while my people lived like beggars, he explained. Ibrahim Traoré showed me that true wealth comes from lifting others up. The phrase, "You are not alone," Zainab's words to a beggar who happened to be president, became a rallying cry for authentic leadership throughout the continent. It was painted on walls in Lagos, chanted at political rallies in Nairobi, and became the unofficial motto of a new generation of African leaders. In South Africa, university students organized Beggar Days, where they lived on the streets for 24 hours to better understand homelessness. Their advocacy led to significant improvements in social services and mental health support programs. The movement even reached beyond Africa. In Brazil, a mayor in São Paulo implemented a program requiring all city officials to spend time in the favelas they were supposed to serve. In India, a state government adopted the Burkina Faso model of leadership training that included mandatory periods of living among the poorest constituents. 5 years after Ibrahim's presidency ended, international economists began referring to the Burkina Faso miracle. The country's GDP had grown by 300%, but more importantly, the benefits of that growth had reached every level of society. Unlike previous African economic booms that enriched only the elite, this growth was built on a foundation of education, healthcare, and sustainable agriculture. The gold mines, now operated as cooperative ventures between the government and local communities, provided steady revenue while ensuring environmental protection. Dr. Zainab Sawadago, now head of the National Health Service, had opened 200 community health clinics across the country. Each clinic was staffed by locally trained healthcare workers who understood the specific needs of their communities. Infant mortality had dropped by 70%, and life expectancy had increased by 15 years. Traoré, who had adopted the former president's surname out of respect, had revolutionized the education system. His network of community schools emphasized practical skills alongside traditional academics. Students learned farming techniques that increased crop yields, business skills that helped them start enterprises, and civic engagement that made them active participants in democracy. The agricultural sector experienced its own transformation. Small farmers, supported by government-provided seeds, tools, and training, increased their productivity dramatically. The country went from being a food importer to being a regional exporter, with surplus crops feeding neighbors during droughts and famines. Ibrahim's most ambitious project began in his third year of retirement. Working with international partners, he established the African Institute for Authentic Leadership in Ouagadougou. The institute offered a unique curriculum that combined traditional political science with what Ibrahim called empathy, training students from across Africa and around the world came to study leadership methods that emphasized understanding over commanding, service over power. The core requirement was a month-long immersion program where future leaders lived and worked among the communities they hoped to serve. One of the institute's first graduates was a young woman named Amara from Mali, who had witnessed her country's struggles with corruption and ethnic conflict. After completing her empathy training in a refugee camp, she returned to Mali and successfully mediated peace agreements between warring factions. Her success was attributed to her genuine understanding of each group's grievances. Another graduate, a young man from Nigeria named Emeka, used his training to reform Lagos's transportation system. Having experienced firsthand the daily struggles of commuters who spent hours in traffic while living in poverty, he designed affordable, efficient public transit that connected the city's slums to job centers. The Institute's influence grew as its graduates took positions in governments, NGOs, and international organizations. They brought with them a new approach to leadership that prioritized listening over speaking, understanding over assumptions, and service over self-interest. As technology advanced, Ibrahim embraced its potential to strengthen the connection between leaders and citizens. He helped develop an innovative app called Ground Truth that allowed citizens to report problems in their communities directly to relevant officials. Unlike traditional complaint systems that often disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, Ground Truth required officials to respond within 48 hours and to provide regular updates on progress. Citizens could rate the quality of responses and track which officials were most effective at solving problems. The app also featured a unique component called Walk With Me, which allowed officials to virtually experience citizens' daily challenges. Using augmented reality and data from community reports, officials could see their cities and regions through the eyes of their constituents, experiencing the impact of broken streetlights on women's safety, understanding how lack of clean water affected children's school attendance, and recognizing how poor road conditions isolated rural communities. The technology was eventually adopted by governments across Africa and beyond. The European Union implemented a similar system after studies showed its effectiveness in increasing government responsiveness and citizen satisfaction. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Burkina Faso's youth. Young people who had once dreamed of escaping to Europe or America now saw their homeland as a place of opportunity and innovation. Zainab's younger brother, Musa, exemplified this change. Instead of attempting the dangerous journey across the Sahara Desert to reach Europe, a path that had claimed the lives of many of his friends, he stayed in Burkina Faso and started a technology company that connected rural farmers with urban markets through mobile platforms. His company, Sahel Connect, allowed farmers to get real-time information about crop prices, weather patterns, and market demand. It also connected them directly with buyers, eliminating middlemen who had historically exploited their lack of market information. Within 3 years, farmers using the platform were earning 400% more than those relying on traditional trading methods. Young women like Aisha Kohn, inspired by President Fatima's example, organized themselves into cooperatives that processed agricultural products for export. Their shea butter collective became the largest supplier to European cosmetics companies, with profits shared equally among all members. These young entrepreneurs didn't just create businesses. They created a new model of economic development that prioritized community benefit over individual wealth accumulation. Companies were evaluated not just on profits, but on their contribution to community well-being, environmental sustainability, and social equality. 10 years after Ibrahim's transformation from beggar to beloved leader, the Burkina Faso model had influenced governance practices worldwide. The World Bank published a comprehensive study showing that countries implementing similar leadership empathy programs experienced higher economic growth, lower corruption rates, and greater social stability than those following traditional development models. The study, titled Leadership from the Ground Up, documented cases from every continent where leaders who had experienced poverty firsthand implemented more effective anti-poverty programs. It showed that countries with empathy-trained leaders had infant mortality rates 40% lower than those with traditionally trained leaders. Harvard Business School added a required course on empathetic leadership to its MBA program, sending students to live in low-income communities before they could graduate. The London School of Economics established a partnership with Ibrahim's Institute, requiring all political science students to complete an empathy training module. The United Nations created a new position, Special Rapporteur on Empathetic Governance. The first appointee was Dr. Zainab Sawadogo, who traveled the world documenting best practices in leadership training and community engagement. Even in established democracies, the Burkina Faso model gained traction. In Canada, the province of Ontario required all new cabinet ministers to spend a week living on minimum wage before taking office. In New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who had studied Ibrahim's methods, implemented similar community engagement requirements for her government. Ministers Ibrahim's ideas about leadership evolved into a comprehensive philosophy that scholars called humble power theory. Unlike traditional political theories that focused on acquiring and maintaining power, humble power theory emphasized using power as a temporary tool for serving others. The theory's core principles included the inversion principle. True leaders must regularly invert their position in society, experiencing life from the bottom up rather than the top down. This prevents the isolation that traditionally accompanies power. The empathy imperative. Leaders cannot effectively serve people whose experiences they cannot understand. Regular immersion in citizens' daily realities is not optional, but essential for good governance. The transparency covenant. Leaders must make their decision-making processes visible to those affected by their decisions. Secret negotiations and hidden agendas inevitably lead to corruption and mistrust. The succession commitment. Good leaders actively prepare their successors and willingly transfer power when their time is complete. The health of institutions matters more than individual ambitions. The service paradigm. Leadership is fundamentally about service, not privilege. Leaders who benefit more from their positions than those they serve have failed in their primary responsibility. Universities around the world began offering courses in humble power theory. Political parties adopted its principles in their platforms. International organizations like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund began evaluating aid recipients based on their commitment to empathetic governance. Not everyone embraced the Burkina Faso model. Critics argued that it was impractical for large, complex nations and that emotional approaches to governance could lead to poor economic decisions. Some international corporations complained that the transparency requirements made business more difficult and expensive. They argued that the emphasis on community benefit over profit discouraged foreign investment and slowed economic growth. Traditional political scientists questioned whether leaders who spent time living in poverty could maintain the objectivity needed for complex policy decisions. They worried that emotional connections to specific communities might lead to favoritism and inefficient resource allocation. Ibrahim addressed these criticisms in a speech at the London School of Economics. Critics say that empathy makes leaders weak, but I argue the opposite. A leader who understands suffering is stronger than one who only understands statistics. A leader who has felt hunger makes better decisions about food policy than one who has only read reports about nutrition. He continued, "They say emotion clouds judgment, but I say ignorance clouds judgment. How can you make good decisions about people you don't understand? How can you solve problems you've never experienced?" The results spoke for themselves. Countries implementing aspects of the Burkina Faso model consistently outperformed others on measures of human development, economic equality, and social stability. Even critics had to acknowledge the measurable improvements in people's lives. 15 years after the marketplace revelation, Ibrahim Traoré remained a teacher in rural Burkina Faso, but his influence had become global. The school where he taught had become a pilgrimage site for young leaders from around the world who came to learn from the man who had redefined leadership. His classroom was simple: wooden desks, a blackboard, and walls decorated with children's drawings. But the lessons taught there influenced presidents, prime ministers, and business leaders worldwide. Students would sit in those small chairs and listen to the former president explain mathematics or literature to 8-year-olds, learning more about leadership in those moments than they ever had in political science classes. One visiting student from Harvard asked Ibrahim why he chose to remain a teacher when he could have any position in the world. Ibrahim smiled and pointed to a young girl in the front row who was struggling with her arithmetic. "Do you see Miriam there?" he asked. "Her father was killed in ethnic violence before I became president. Her mother works 3 jobs to support 4 children. Miriam is the smartest student I've ever taught. But she almost dropped out because she felt her dreams were impossible." He paused, watching as Miriam successfully solved a difficult problem and beamed with pride. "Last week, she told me she wants to be a doctor like Dr. Zainab. If I can help one Miriam believe in her dreams, I am exercising more real power than any president could ever have," the Harvard student later wrote in his thesis. "I went to Africa expecting to learn about governance and returned understanding that the highest form of leadership is teaching a child to believe in herself." As Ibrahim entered his 70s, he began to reflect on the cyclical nature of his journey from soldier to president to beggar to teacher. He often spoke to his students about the importance of remembering where they came from and staying connected to the earth that had given them life. "Power is like water," he would tell them. "It flows naturally from high places to low places. But when we build dams to keep it for ourselves, it becomes stagnant and poisonous. True leaders are like rivers. They carry life from the mountains to the valleys, enriching everything they touch." His health began to decline, but he refused offers to move to better medical facilities in the capital. "I lived among my people as president," he said. "I will die among them as their neighbor." The small rural hospital where he received treatment became another classroom. Young medical students from around the world came to observe not just the medical care of a famous patient, but the dignity with which he faced mortality. Dr. Zainab, now an international health expert, personally oversaw his care. Their conversations were recorded, with Ibrahim's permission, and later studied by leadership scholars as examples of how power relationships could be based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. "Do you remember," Ibrahim asked her during one visit, "when you gave bread to a stranger in the marketplace?" Zainab smiled through her tears. "I remember a man who taught me that kindness is never wasted, even when we don't know who we're being kind to. And I learned," Ibrahim replied, "that sometimes the most important person in a leader's life is a child who sees him as just another hungry human being." Ibrahim Traoré died on a quiet Tuesday morning, surrounded by his students, former colleagues, and the children he had taught to dream beyond their circumstances. His last words, according to Zainab, who held his hand, were, Tell them that the earth remembers every act of kindness." His funeral became the largest gathering in Burkina Faso's history. Presidents and prime ministers came from around the world, but they sat alongside farmers, teachers, street vendors, and former beggars, all equal in their grief and gratitude. The service was held not in a cathedral or government building, but in the marketplace where his transformation had begun. Zainab, now an elderly woman herself, spoke for the mourners. He showed us that leadership is not about rising above people, but about lifting people up. He proved that the distance between a palace and a marketplace is not measured in meters, but in understanding. And he taught us that sometimes you have to lose everything, your position, your pride, your comfort, to find what matters most. Years passed, and the world changed, but the lessons of the beggar president endured. In classrooms around the globe, children learned about the leader who chose to become powerless so he could truly serve the powerless. In government offices, the question, "What would Ibrahim do?" became a standard way of evaluating policy proposals. The marketplace in Ouagadougou became a shrine, with a simple plaque marking the spot where Ibrahim had sat as a beggar. The inscription, in Arabic, French, and Moray, read simply, "Here a president learned to serve by learning to suffer. Here a nation learned that its strength lay not in its gold, but in its compassion." But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the continuing transformation of lives. Mariam, the struggling student from Ibrahim's classroom, did become a doctor. She opened a clinic in her village and named it the Beggar's Hope, a place where treatment was free, for those who had nothing and priced according to ability for those who had something. Thousands of leaders trained in the Burkina Faso model continued to serve in governments worldwide. They carried with them not just policies or procedures, but a fundamental understanding that true power comes from understanding powerlessness. And in markets and streets across Africa and beyond, when someone saw a person in need, they remembered the story of a president who became a beggar and a child who shared her bread. They remembered that in those simple acts of human connection, revolutions begin and nations are transformed. The beggar president's greatest victory was not the policies he implemented or the corruption he exposed, but the simple truth he embedded in human hearts, that every person, regardless of their station in life, deserves dignity, compassion, and the chance to believe that they are not alone. In the end, Ibrahim Traoré proved that the most revolutionary act a leader can perform is not to seize power, but to surrender it, to step down from the throne and sit in the dust, to close the distance between ruler and ruled, and to remember that leadership is not about being served, but about serving others. His story became more than history. It became a living philosophy that continued to transform leaders and nations long after the man himself had returned to the earth he had never forgotten how to touch with humility. The earth remembers every act of kindness. When we forget this, we lose our way. When we remember it, we find our purpose. Ibrahim Traoré, final words. He showed us that the distance between a palace and a marketplace is not measured in meters, but in understanding. Dr. Zainab Sawadogo at Ibrahim Traoré's funeral. Sometimes you have to become a beggar to learn how to truly serve. Inscription on the memorial plaque, Ouagadougou Marketplace, the end.